You've advertised yourself at the outset as a kind of limp-wristed, pretentious wimp, and I can't take you seriously.
All right. Yeah, that's me that he's talking about. Hi, I'm Christopher, aka the Nerdy Christian, and I ticked off Matt Walsh by saying that something he said, was kind of racist. Now, what's funny is I wasn't even calling him a racist. Someone can say something that displays racial bias unfairly, and that can be called out without them being racist. In fact, that was the point of my video that Matt got so frustrated and upset by. And so he made a pretty scathing 3-minute response if you take out my video time and the ad time, in which he just called me a lot of names. but we'll get into that in a moment, and we will provide the proper rebuttal that he has requested.
You don't offer a rebuttal.
Challenge accepted, Matt Walsh. But first, some level setting here, guys. I've actually worked in this space for about 5 years of my life. I did work in minority majority communities in South Boston. This comment kind of cracked me up because it's like, dude, I've been threatened in these kind of tough areas, and the guy that threatened me, I wasn't intimidated by the color of his skin or concerned about the color of his skin in the slightest. What intimidated me was the teardrop tattoos on his face. If you know what that means, there was reason for me to be concerned in that instance. So what I did in this community was I worked for a nonprofit called Fathers Uplift. I led their development efforts for about 5 years. I've raised a few $1 million for services to help Black men overcome different cycles of trauma, of father absence, of drug abuse, and all sorts of different things that contribute to the disparities and outcomes that we see today, including what Matt Walsh wants to talk about here, disparities in violence. So let's go ahead and hear out what he had to say about my original video. And if you want to see my original video here, I'll put it right up here and you can go watch that. But let's hear out what he had to say about my video about implicit bias, and then get into the data that he has so not quite so graciously requested.
A few days ago, we did a segment where I was responding to some of the TikTok social media influencers who were angry at me for my take on the Austin Metcalf murder. And I guess we missed this guy. He's a Christian influencer responding to my tweet about the Austin Metcalf killing, where I talk about how young black males are disproportionately violent. And this guy who goes by the handle Nerdy Christian and is a bit of a following.
That's me.
But he didn't like that very much. And here's what he has to say. Listen. I just cannot imagine at this point in time using the term problematic unironically as he does here. Yeah, sorry guys, that's a bit problematic. That's problematic language. I've already tuned you out the moment you do that. You've advertised yourself at the outset as a kind of limp-wristed, pretentious wimp, and I can't take you seriously.
Yes, a very Christ-like speech, Matt. Certainly abiding by Colossians 4:6, except not really. It's also quite the ad hominem. You're ignoring the substance of my argument, which was that implicit bias exists, and you were displaying it with your generalization of an entire race of young men. But hey, whatever. Go off, King.
Also, notice what he doesn't do. As we saw with the other influencers who were angry, as we always see in these situations, he doesn't dispute my point. My point about the data, about the demographics and the data, who's committing the majority of violent crime and so on. That was my point. He doesn't dispute it. He doesn't present any kind of counter argument. He doesn't say, well, Matt is wrong about this point, and here's the data to back me up. He doesn't do that. None of them ever do. All the people who get offended and they start blubbering about how it's problematic, they never, ever, ever even attempt to dispute the actual point because they can't. So, that's all that really needs to be said. You don't offer a rebuttal, so there's no argument to refute here. You didn't present one.
Good, sir. The video you're responding to was never intended as a direct rebuttal. Did you listen to the first 10 seconds?
Sometime tomorrow, I want to talk about why this is really problematic and racist. But first, I want to get ahead of that just with exposing a misconception that I think a lot of us have about racism and what it is.
As you can see, the purpose of my video was not to rebut your data, which you never specify, but I did present to you an argument. It just wasn't the one that you wanted. The purpose of my original clip was to level set. It was to lay the groundwork, because we have to lower defenses when we talk about this topic, so that so often go up when we discuss racism, because no one wants to feel like they're being compared to the KKK. You actually came out all right because of this too, because I obviously had an issue with what you said, but I wasn't calling you a racist. It's kind of funny that you get so offended, because I was specifically pointing out that anyone can fall victim to implicit bias, as I believe that you have. So you shouldn't even have felt uniquely called out. But anyways, hey, challenge accepted. Let's dispute your actual point, or rather 2 actual points, because you engage in racism twice in your original tweet in kind of slightly different ways. So we'll address first the general accusation that you make at the end, that young black men are violent to a wildly, outrageously disproportionate degree. Since you don't actually cite any specific data and just vaguely refer to some boogeyman that you call the data, I'm going to guess that you're referring to the fact that a disproportionate share of violent crime is committed by black men relative to their share of the population. I'm guessing that you're talking about the fact that 14% of this population has been arrested for over 40% of violent crime over the last 10 years, according to the FBI Crime Data Explorer. However, it's worth noting that's arrests, not convictions, so this ignores the 50% of violent crime that goes uncleared each year, meaning that no arrest is made. So I'd even take everything here with a little bit of a grain of salt. There are reasons that this could be, that the actual figures could be lower or higher here, which I'll display in some text right here. But yeah, let's run with it. Say we have 40% of violent crimes committed by black men. The thing is, once you glance past that surface stat, the holes quickly become apparent. And this is where your racist bias shows, Matt. What ratio of black men are committing these crimes? Is it a large enough ratio to label young black men across the board as violent? No, you've fallen victim to the hasty generalization fallacy. So let's unpack this. Yes, 40% of violent crime seems to be committed by black males, but what proportion of black males commit these crimes? Well, there's actually no way to tell quite for sure with the data that's available, at least not over a multi-year period. We don't have a count of the actual crimes or the actual criminals for each category. We just know the count of crimes. Different people commit more than one crime. We don't know, too, the number of convictions. We just know the arrests. So things get pretty messy. But we do know from this DOJ report that over a 10-year period, roughly 44% of individuals who were previously incarcerated for violent crimes will recidivate for another violent crime. So we have the total violent crime count for black Americans over 10 years here, an estimation of 80% of it being attributable to men, and that recidivism rate. And with that, we can calculate an estimate of about 1.25 million black men having committed violent crimes the last 10 years, which comes out to just over 1 in 20. That's a far cry from your generalization that all young black men are violent to a wildly, outrageously disproportionate degree. Now, to my next point, it's obvious that the color of one's skin is not the causal factor. What's the causal factor here? That's what you want to talk about. That's what would need to be changed. If you want to talk about an issue in a population, you should talk about the causal factors behind that issue. Obviously, the color of their skin is not the causal factor. Now, you might respond, well, yeah, obviously it's the culture that I'm talking about. But first, you didn't say anything about that culture. You implied that if one had to guess the race of an assailant in an altercation, here, we'll put your tweet back up here. You said if someone had to guess the race of the assailant in an altercation that involved a white man and a black man, that the black man would clearly be the assailant. That's what you implied. Statistically, though, this makes no sense. And you're going to say probably, well, yeah, black men commit crimes at a disproportionate degree. To which I say, yeah, and they're the victims of crimes to a disproportionate degree, too. The misguided way in which you have applied the statistic means that the black man in this imaginary scenario of yours is both more likely to be the offender and to be the victim. Now, obviously, the way in which you've applied the data, even on a purely statistical basis here, we've shown is kind of nonsense. I'm going to hold you to what you said, too. You didn't say anything about culture or any other actual causal variables. You said something about race. We all know that if you added a detail to your imaginary scenario that the black man, say, was in a suit and tie and the white man was in a wife beater, the vast majority of people would assume that the white man was the perpetrator. But why is this? Why does that make a difference? Because it's not about race, dude, and you know that. Race is not the active variable. Funny enough, while you say black culture is the problem, the very conservative scholar Thomas Sowell argues that black culture is merely derived from poor white southern sharecropper culture. So what you're really critiquing involves both blacks and whites. But you know what? I would disagree with you that the primary variable is culture in the first place. That's not what the data shows. The data shows that the variables that affect the rates of crime, known as criminogenic factors, they're not primarily of race or culture, but rather things much more common to us all. This study from the Brookings Institution found two interesting things happen when you control for criminogenic factors. One, the racial disparities in crime disappear, and two, the racial disparities in police shootings also seem to disappear. The fact is that much of what we as a society attribute to race on both the left and the right is really attributable to underlying factors of class, environment, trauma, unemployment, education, etc. So if you want to resolve the issues faced by a lot of these communities, it doesn't have anything to do. You don't need to talk about their race necessarily. You need to talk about these criminogenic factors. Now, unfortunately, due to a variety of factors in the history of the U.S., these criminogenic factors are disproportionately proportioned among different racial groups, but they're still the causal factors. But the problem is that proportion of those factors among different racial groups results in implicit bias because people see skin color a lot more quickly than they see someone's educational background or income level or any of these other things that are actually the impactful variables. But those are the active variables, not race. The study engaged in by the author of that Brookings Institution study, Howard Henderson, found that when controlling for those criminogenic factors, there is not a statistical correlation between increased black population in a city and crime rates. And this makes sense. As Howard points out, there are plenty of thriving communities that are majority black. So Matt Walsh, you've misdiagnosed the entire issue. If you actually want to see violence decrease in black and brown communities in the U.S., how about supporting efforts to reduce father absence? As we know, children raised in fatherless households are about 100% more likely to be incarcerated as adults. And that black and Hispanic dads haven't seen their kids in the last month at a rate about 50% higher than their white counterparts, which again has roots that we can get into that go way back beyond just people's individual failures, although everyone is also responsible for their decisions. Let's go on to another thing. If you want to see violence decrease, invest in mental health and trauma support services, as we know that traumatized individuals are more likely to engage in crime themselves. And black Americans are victims of crime, victims of different traumatic events at significantly disproportionate rates compared to the general population. If you want to see violence decrease in black America, put efforts into reducing the implicit biases faced by black Americans that increase criminogenic factors such as unemployment or low educational attainment. Just look at this list of captured data on the effects of implicit bias. You responded to my video on implicit bias, Matt, without making any claims about whether implicit bias is real or accurate or not. I imagine it was because, as the Scientific American here states, the evidence is overwhelming. You could not rebut what I said, so you instead insulted me several times, even going so far as implying I'm not actually a Christian. Speaking of, let's wrap up with hearing what you had to say on that topic.
I'll say, just for the record, that, and this is why this kind of thing from someone like that annoys me in particular, when you've got Christian, in your handle and you're identifying yourself as a Christian. I will say that you really do immeasurable harm to the faith when you pretend that the faith you pretend to hold, when you go around representing Christianity this way, when you represent Christianity as a religion that makes you weak and scared and pathetic, a religion that forbids us from speaking uncomfortable truths that, again, he does not actually dispute. He just doesn't want you to talk about it. When you present Christianity that way, you make it seem totally unappealing and useless and pointless. I mean, why would anyone want to be a part of a religion like that? Why would anyone want to be Christian if it requires them to be scared, equivocating little weaklings? They won't, which is why churches that appeal to this guy, churches that are like right down the center plate for this guy, what he wants, they're all dying. They're decaying and they're dying because of this. Because in reality, that's not Christianity. Not only are we not prohibited from speaking uncomfortable truths as Christians, we're actually required to. We are called to. Uncomfortable truth could be the subtitle of every gospel account. Jesus was the ultimate preacher of uncomfortable truths. So every part of this is just false and wrong, pathetic and false and wrong and bad and harmful.
Yeah, so a few things for you and your followers to hear, Matt. First, Christianity is the faith of the weak. In 2 Corinthians 11, Paul says, "If boasting is necessary, I will boast about my weakness." So in the next chapter, he adds that God told him, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is perfected in weakness." He goes on to say, "Therefore I will most gladly boast all the more about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may reside in me. So I take pleasure in weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and in difficulties for the sake of Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong." In 1 Corinthians 1, 27 through 31, Paul writes some other stuff about being weak in and of ourselves and relying on God's strength. So it sounds like you have a problem with Paul, not with me. Jesus himself said, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." So yeah, Matt, I am weak, and everyone who wants to follow Christ should embrace and accept their own weaknesses in and of themselves and find true strength in Christ. To be self-aware and cognizant of our shortcomings, Matt, is not weak. It is the Christian way. Knowing our failings and turning to God in the midst of them is precisely what Christ demands of us. Those who refuse to acknowledge our own fragility and propensity for sin and evil are in danger of never being allowed into the gates of heaven. As for the nature of your speech in general, really do go read Colossians 4, 6. And then the previous chapter in verses 8 through 11 has some good words for you too. Take some notes on how you choose to talk to people, please, dude. Like, not just for my sake, I'm a Christian, but just like for the sake of anyone who you may put off from the kingdom of heaven because of how you've spoken to them while representing Christ. All that to say, people out there, anyone watching this, don't be racist. And try to just be cognizant of some of the biases you might have for sometimes unfair reasons. And recognize that it's not race, it's not the color of people's skin that is the causal, active variables behind why people have a higher propensity or lower propensity for doing things. There are a lot of complex reasons as to why us humans do the things we do, and people can be helped to improve their lives, but that help doesn't come from condemning them based on the color of their skin and making judgments about them because of the color of their skin. I mean, what Matt Walsh suggests here is exactly why we had the huge issue with the Central Park Five almost being wrongly incarcerated and being wrongly accused of crimes in New York, right? Because people assumed they had committed a crime because of the color of their skin, which is what Matt Walsh is advocating for when he makes this tweet here. So don't do that, you guys. And let's just all generally, as Christians, be more fair, equitable, loving, and kind people. Sound good? Shalom, friends.